So it is my honor. Again, I'm Audrey Bilger. I'm president of Reed College, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our faculty speaker for this year's reunions lecture. The speaker is Professor Pancho Savery. It is, by the way, it's one of the joys of being president of Reed to be able to work with amazing, talented, brilliant faculty, and Pancho is one of the most extraordinary of our faculty. And so I know that you're all in for a real treat. Pancho, don't undermine me. Pancho has taught as a professor of English, humanities, and American studies at Reed since 1995. He received his undergraduate degree at Stanford University, his graduate degree at Cornell, and has held previous teaching positions at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, Cornell University, Ithaca College. At Reed, Pancho Savery teaches courses in American literature post-1850 and modern and contemporary American and European drama. He also teaches in Reed's first-year humanities program and covers the ancient Mediterranean world, Mesopotamia, Greece, Egypt, Persia, and Palestine, as well as Mexico City and Harlem. I was noting that Pancho and I were slated, as many of you know, in 2020 to go on the road. Some of you might have been looking forward to seeing Pancho lecture to give us a sense of what a Hume lecture sounds and feels like. Maybe a few of you were able to be at the chapel for one of the last events before we all shut down. And so again, I can say you're in for something special today to be able to hear from Pancho. And I'll turn it over to Olga, who's going to be our MC for this program today. Olga?
Thank you, Audrey. Thanks for being here. And thank you, Pancho. I don't have very many remarks. Audrey just covered them all. The one thing I would like to say is there will be a Q&A after Pancho is done with the lecture. So feel free throughout this presentation to add any questions or feedback into the chat, and I'll be pulling those together, and then we'll direct them to Pancho at the end. So Pancho, we hand the mic to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Audrey, for your very gracious intro. And thanks to Olga for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for showing up. It's nice to see that there are a lot of people here. So when Olga asked me to give a talk, I asked her if she had any ideas for a theme, because I had no idea what I could or would want to talk about. And she suggested the topic of civil rights. However, I chose to define that term. So I started meditating on it, and the first place I ended up going was to a course I had taught several years ago. That course was based on the book by Kenneth Warren that was published in 2011, entitled What Was African American Literature? And Warren argued that African American literature as an entity was a specific product of the civil rights movement. And he defined the civil rights movement as ending in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So what I decided to do was to teach a course based on his idea. So I taught a course on African-American fiction, and I did things before 1965 and after 1965, because Warren was arguing that post-1965 writing by Black Americans was no longer able to be called African-American literature and was just American literature. So I taught this course, and at the conclusion of the course, we decided that Warren was wrong, that in fact, there was not a significant difference between African-American literature written post-1965 and pre-1965. And in thinking about that, I realized that I had only sort of covered half of the issue, which was what was African-American literature. And because Warren had said that African-American literature was contained within the civil rights movement, then I started asking myself, what exactly was the civil rights movement and when was the civil rights movement? And the conclusion that I came to in both, in the cases of both the civil rights movement and African-American literature as an entity, that both of them are in fact still going on, and there is no was in either one of them. One of the interesting things I was thinking about was in terms of the term civil rights, what exactly does civil mean? There's civil as opposed to military, as in civilian, or civil as opposed to the clergy. There's also civil in terms of politeness, and there's civil in terms of legal rights. So I came to the conclusion that, some people would argue that there couldn't have been a civil rights movement until Black people gained civil rights. And when did that happen? Theoretically, that happened after the Civil War with the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But then I started to go back before that, and I came to the conclusion that that doesn't really make sense, because prior to the Civil War, there obviously was what we could call a civil rights movement. There was the abolitionist movement. There was Harriet Beecher Stowe. There was Thoreau. There was John Brown. There was slave revolts. There were the slave narratives of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. They were all part of a movement. And so clearly, both African-American literature and the civil rights movement existed prior to the end of the Civil War. As an aside, we had this wonderful period post the Civil War known as Reconstruction. And for the 10 or so years that Reconstruction existed, that was probably the only time in American history when the United States really lived up to what it said that it believed in, that everybody was equal. That was a period when, because there were federal troops in the South, they guaranteed the rights for the formerly enslaved, and Black people were elected to governorships, state legislatures, seats in Congress, etc. And unfortunately, after the federal troops were removed, we had the beginning of the Jim Crow era. And people tried to go back to the way things had been during the time of slavery. I am very much in favor of the argument that Michelle Alexander makes in The New Jim Crow, that there have been and continue to be essentially 3 stages of slavery in the United States. There was actual slavery, which ended after the Civil War. That was replaced by Jim Crow and sharecropping, which was just slavery by another name. And then she argues that when Jim Crow officially ended with the Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1994, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965, that marked the end of legalized Jim Crow. But Alexander argues that as slavery was replaced by Jim Crow was replaced by mass incarceration. And what obviously is in common with all three of those things is use and exploitation of free Black labor. And so from that perspective, one can say that the civil rights movement has never really ended because there are continuous problems that Black people have living in America. Even though Black people are legally free, we still have all kinds of discrepancies in wealth acquisition, access to healthcare, life expectancy, infant mortality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, so most people think of the civil rights movement as existing in this very short period of time from the late 1940s or early 1950s up until 1965. And we tend to think of it in terms of the legal cases that Thurgood Marshall argued leading up to the Brown decision, the outrage over the lynching of Emmett Till, and then Rosa Parks's refusing to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, and then the bus boycott following that. But it's really important, again, to go all the way back and to see that there has been a continuous civil rights movement. So we could go back to the 1890s, for example, when the crusading journalist Ida B. Wells was writing about lynching. And it's very interesting that before she started writing, most people bought the argument, even Black people bought the argument, that when a Black person was lynched by a white mob, the person who was lynched was guilty of some crime. And the crime that was usually enunciated was the crime of raping a white woman. And Wells did all this incredible investigative journalism and discovered that, in fact, that was not the case. And she started writing articles in newspapers in the South, pointing out that most of the time when lynching occurred, not only was it this incredible public spectacle, people came from miles around to watch a lynching. It was almost like going to a football game. People brought their children to watch lynchings. Most of the time when lynchings happened, the reason was that white people had decided that Black people were getting too independent and not knowing their place. And so lynching was used as a tool of control. And so Ida B. Wells, in writing the various editorials she wrote, pointed out the real reason why lynchings were taking place. So that was one part of a civil rights movement, and that was her strategy, to use journalism to tell the truth. Another strategy was that of Booker T. Washington, who essentially came up with the notion of what we would probably today call Black capitalism. Washington argued that if Black people worked with their hands and made money, that money would guarantee acceptance on the part of the larger white community. Washington, interestingly enough, was the person who deemed the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, as the Negro Wall Street. I don't know if you have seen any of the documentaries that have been on television the last couple of weeks. I have spent 7 or 8 hours watching documentaries on Tulsa. And it is clear that Washington's strategy did not work either. And what happened in Tulsa was the proof of that. That it's interesting that the Greenwood section of Tulsa developed because of racism and discrimination. White folks in Tulsa didn't want to deal with Black folks, and so Black folks had to set up their own community, their own theaters, their own doctors, their own lawyers, their own insurance agents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when people started getting wealthy from that, the white folks in town didn't like that and burned everything down, which was exactly the same reason why lynchings had happened before that. Anytime there was any significant degree of Black self-determination, the white population took it out. So Booker T. Washington's strategy didn't really work. Then later on, we had the strategy of W.E.B. Du Bois and the founding of first the Niagara movement that then evolved into the NAACP. And Du Bois was arguing for higher education and that and participation in government. And for Du Bois, that was a Black strategy that again was part of a civil rights movement. Later on, when that didn't seem to be working, Black people were getting education, but it didn't make a difference. Then we had the strategy of Marcus Garvey, who in the late 1920s basically said, there's no hope for Black people in the United States, time to leave and go back to Africa. That strategy didn't work either. Also in the 20s and 30s, we had the literary movement that came to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the main philosophical voices there was Alan Locke. And Locke argued in a similar way to Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington said, if you make enough money, you'll be respected and treated as equal. Locke argued, if we create great literature, we will be respected. And he argued that no society that had ever created great literature and art has ever been underlooked. So in the 1920s and 30s, you had this proliferation of great Black writing, art, music, etc. And unfortunately, that didn't work either, despite all of the great artistic accomplishments. I mean, think about, I date the Harlem Renaissance as going from 1919 to 1939. And in 1939, we had 4 great examples of Black music that was part of the civil rights movement. First, we had Marian Anderson singing at the Lincoln Memorial in 1939. Then we had, in a kind of statement of Black patriotism. Then we had also in 1939, Billy Strayhorn writing Take the A Train. He got the title of the song because he was going to Duke Ellington's house to compose the song, and Duke Ellington gave him the directions, take the A Train. And so you had, in that song, you had the joyousness of Black life. Also in 1939, we had an example of Black elegance and style in Coleman Hawkins doing Body and Soul. And then, most spectacularly in 1939, we had Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit, in which he talks about lynching in the South. Again, all of this is part of the overall point that we cannot limit the concept of the civil rights movement to just the late 40s and into the mid 60s. Later on in the 1940s, another example of a form of the civil rights movement was the invention of bebop. Bebop, invented by Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Kenny Clark, and Thelonious Monk, the high priest of bop. Bebop was a response to how jazz had been taken over in the earlier 1940s. So in the 20s and 30s, we had Duke Ellington and Count Basie. And then later in the 40s, that style of music was taken and watered down by people like Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey and Jimmy Dorsey. Interestingly enough, that is the only time when jazz was very popular, when it was watered down for white consumption. And so bebop said, we are going to play music that white people cannot copy. And so they started playing fast music and chord changes in ways that was difficult to duplicate. So bebop was also a form of a civil rights movement. Think about Dr. King. If the civil rights movement ended in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, then why was King still doing his thing after that? An interesting thing about King is that, at the end of his life, he was organizing a poor people's march. And it's interesting that he starts talking about economics and he starts talking about class and not just talking about race. And when he started talking about class, that's when he became really dangerous, because obviously there are more poor people than there are rich people. And if all the poor people got together, things would be different. But the white power structure, realizing that, has kept poor people of color and poor white people separated from each other, and has made it impossible for people to see that they have common problems and a common enemy. And I believe that is why King was killed when he was killed, because he stopped talking exclusively about race and started talking about class. But after King, there was still a civil rights movement. Certainly, Malcolm X was part of a civil rights movement. Obviously, the Black Panthers were a part of a civil rights movement. The demonstration in 1968 at the Olympics, when John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their black gloved fists on the podium, was part of a civil rights movement. Uncovering what happened in Tulsa is part of a civil rights movement. What Brian Stevenson is doing in Alabama with the Equal Justice Initiative, where he is working to get Black people who are on death row, get them new trials and get them out of prison. Alabama has the highest per capita rate of executions. So my point here is that there has been a continuous civil rights movement. Unfortunately, because the conditions of the lives of Black people have not sufficiently gotten better. And so both African-American literature and the civil rights movement are both continuing. I also wanted to say just something a little briefly about what I think of as Reed's part in the continuing civil rights movement with the changing of the Hum 110 syllabus. As most of you know, 3 years ago, faculty voted to change the syllabus. Prior to that, Hum 110 had been all Greece in the fall and Rome and the Bible in the spring. And 3 years ago, we got rid of all the Roman material and replaced it with 2 units, one on the history of Tenochtitlan, which became Mexico City, and then the Harlem Renaissance. And this was done in response to some protests by students who felt, and legitimately so, that because Hum 110 is the only course that is required of all students at Reed, because it is the introduction to what it means to be a college student, because it is the introduction to Reed's favorite phrase, the life of the mind, the thought was that students were being told through the way the syllabus had been organized that the life of the mind only consisted of dead white dudes. And so in changing the syllabus to talking about Mexico City and Harlem, that was a continuation at Reed of a form of the civil rights movement. Students wanted to see themselves reflected in the syllabus of the only course that is required at Reed. And so in making that change, Reed was making a recognition of the importance of that idea, that people need to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So, and again, education is such an important pillar of the civil rights movement. Remember that back in the days of slavery, it was a crime for any Black person, any slave, to read and write. And it was a crime for any white person to teach a slave how to read and write. And in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, published in 1845, he over and over and over again talks about the importance of education and how, and slave owners knew that education makes for a disgruntled slave. The more education you have, the more freedom you want, the more you are going to protest the conditions under which you are living. So I think that there's a real connection between the argument for literacy and its importance and the changing of the Hum 110 syllabus to reflect the wider world of literature, art, and philosophy, and that it is not just exclusive to dead white people. And because of that, I really think that Reed is moving in the right direction. I think that, when I came to Reed, there was only one other Black faculty member. And Reed is moving in the right direction in terms of increasing the number of faculty members of color. It is moving in the right direction in terms of increasing the number of students who are students of color. It has done a really good job. in that way. And so I'm always happy to talk about a topic like this and to make a connection between actual lives that people are living and what's happening in the educational world in terms of the curriculum. So that is sort of my final point, that on the one hand, it's unfortunate that the civil rights movement is still continuing. And obviously Black Lives Matter and all the demonstrations that have happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, all of that is part of a continuing civil rights movement. It is unfortunate that it has to keep continuing, but obviously that is unfortunately the nature of the racism that has existed and continues to exist. And I am happy that Reed is doing its part in that movement, both by increasing the diversity of the faculty and the student body, and in terms of changing the curriculum in Hum 110. I think I'll pause there. I would much rather answer people's questions and engage in dialogue than making a long-winded speech.
Thank you, Pancho. This is a great group that we've gathered here today. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to put your ideas, your thoughts, exchange ideas here through the chat. I'm going to offer some to Pancho. And then Audrey, if at any point you want to lean in and give remarks, just flag us down or jump in. Okay. So one question we have from Dylan is, how have the faculty responded to the new Hum 110? Do they enjoy these new parts of the course? Have the Mexico City and Harlem Renaissance sections led to similar classes in various departments like English and history?
I was afraid somebody was going to ask me that question. So I will say several things. Again, I'm really glad that the syllabus changed. From my perspective, students very much like the material. They are very much into it. Faculty was very enthusiastic about changing the syllabus. I do have to say I have not been totally satisfied at the way that things have gone. One of the things I have noticed, particularly in the Harlem section, is that when faculty members are giving Hume lectures, they have often tended to put form at the forefront rather than content. And that has resulted in not talking about race to the degree that people could. And so why is that the case? I can only speculate. I ask my students, talk to your friends in other Hume conferences and find out what's going on. And what my students have said is that their friends have said that they don't think race gets talked about enough. And that they think, they don't know the answer, they think that there's a degree of maybe fear is the right word on the part of some white faculty members. Don't want to say the wrong thing in class. Don't want to be accused by students of being racist. And so to kind of overcompensate for that, they talk less about race in the classroom than they probably should. And that has led to another issue. Is it okay? Is it proper, whatever the right word is, for white faculty members to teach Black subject matter? And I know that some students have been upset / concerned about that. And I get asked that question all the time by students. What do I think about that? And one of the things I point out to students is that nobody ever asked me if I had to be English to teach Shakespeare. Nobody ever asked me if I had to be Irish to teach Joyce. And so I think that in terms of teaching African-American material, the same thing is true. I had to do my homework to learn how to teach Joyce. I had to do my homework to learn how to teach Shakespeare. And so white faculty have to do their homework in order to teach African-American literary materials, and they have just as much right to do that as anybody else does. The work is the work. And if you do your homework and learn how to teach the material, then you have a right to teach the material.
Pancho,
That's kind of a long answer to a short question.
No, but it's a big question, and I wanted to jump in because I hear what you're saying, and I think that we're still processing and digesting the changes to the Hume syllabus, and that the students are speaking, right? And they're saying they would like to get some different approaches from their faculty, and as you're saying, a kind of awareness of race in writing about texts that are inflected by race. It is quite similar to an awareness of the history of Ireland and where Joyce is coming from, right? So one of the I know that those who are here would be heartened to know that the students have worked to put together a program that will be piloted next year. So we've had in the past student fellows who participate in classes to it's part of the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I may be using the wrong word, Pancho, I'm not sure if they're called fellows, but they come there, a faculty member can say, I want a student in my classroom. He'll just be there and he'll talk to me after class. What did you see happening? Was I calling on more men than women? Was I letting a certain person dominate the discussion? And so there's going to be a cohort of students who are going to do this to really help faculty who are interested in improving their skills in talking about texts, where maybe, as Pancho said, white faculty may feel discomfort or a sense of uncertainty or worry, to have the students say, yeah, you said that thing. And that was actually a microaggression. Let me explain to you what a microaggression is. Our faculty are learners. The faculty who are signing on for this will be learners. And the students' hope is that this is something that will become an established part of Hume 110. Pancho, I having said that, I want to just get your thoughts on that and how you see that as a moment in the evolution of the course.
I think it's a great idea. I have used students in that context for several years, not specifically on the topic of race, but just in general in terms of having another pair of eyes on the class dynamic and how things are going, and having feedback from the students, I have found really, really useful and valuable. And so I am hoping that this new program that is going to concentrate specifically on faculty members talking about racial topics, I'm really hopeful that that will work out. And I'm very happy that it is happening.
If I could just ask one more follow-up, because I know how you handle your conferences. The way that you facilitate a conference discussion is you come in, you sit down.
Actually, I don't sit down.
Oh.
I don't even sit down anymore. I used to come in and sit down. What I do is I am continually walking in a circle around the classroom. I find that when I sit at the table, people direct all their energy at me, and I don't want the energy directed at me. So I'm constantly walking in a circle around the room, and I try to stand behind the person who is talking so that that person cannot direct their comments at me and is directing them, in fact, at the rest of the people in the room. I am a religious believer in the conference method of education. And for me, that means that the primary energy in the classroom is supposed to come from the students. It's not supposed to come from me. My job is not to teach people everything they need to know about Plato and Aristotle. My job is to help to create the right environment, the right atmosphere in which students can teach themselves and teach the other people in the room.
That's great. And thank you, Audrey, for jumping in. We have a bunch of questions. Thank you to everyone in the chat. I'm going to stick with Hume 110 for a little bit longer, and then we'll go into more of the content of the lecture that you gave us, Pancho. So one question is about the creation of the new curriculum. Allison is asking, how were the particular areas of Mexico City and Harlem Renaissance and Harlem chosen? And Allison says she would have loved to study those.
So, so there were two different principles being engaged in the Mexico City section. We are going from 1520, when the conquistadors arrived in the person of Cortez, and we are going up to the Zapatista movement and the Olympics in 1968. So we are covering more than 400 years. And so once we decided that that was how we wanted to teach Mexico City, we decided that the other unit, it would be best to do a much shorter concentration of time. So in the Harlem unit, we are basically going from the 1890s to 1952. So we're covering a much shorter period of time. In terms of the curriculum itself, we had various outside experts come in and run faculty seminars on how to teach the Mexico City material. The syllabus for the Harlem section was mostly devised by me.
Great, thank you. John is asking us, what was white about the ancient Mediterranean world?
What was white about the ancient Mediterranean world? That's a really interesting question. People in the ancient Mediterranean did not look at color and race the same way we look at color and race now. So, and that's one of the things in teaching the ancient Mediterranean, that is one of the things that we try to stress. I guess I would say that that notion hasn't worked as well as it could have, because students still tend to think of that material for the most part as being created by white people. I mean, when I started at Reed and we were just doing Greece and Rome, that was more of an issue. And that's part of the reason why the syllabus was changed to include Egypt and Persia and Mesopotamia, so that we are dealing with a multicultural Mediterranean world in which all kinds of different cultures were coming together and influencing each other.
Great. There's someone here from the class of 1973 who's talking about Hume curriculum changes over time. And Pat's question is, about the syllabus change 3 years ago versus the agitation and unrest about the Hume syllabus in the late 1960s. In her freshman year, there was much agitation from the Black Students Union and allies about the Hume curriculum. Was it largely that at that time, no one in the administration was open to change? Or could it have been more about this argument about the classical bias of Western civilization?
Well, I was not at Reed in 1969. So, you know, what I know about that time period is that there was agitation on the part of students, as there was at colleges and universities all over the country, for a Black Studies program. And there was a Black Studies program at Reed that was funded, I believe it was by the Ford Foundation. And it was funded for a limited amount of time. And when the funding ran out, the faculty voted not to continue the program. You know, at that time, Black Studies was not considered to be a legitimate academic field. And so there was a lot of struggle over that. I think now one of the things that has happened is that Black Studies, however one wants to define it, is now regarded as a quote unquote legitimate academic field. And there's all kinds of great work that is being done in that field. And I think that that is a great sign of how higher education can change in response to the times.
A question about how students are engaging in this curriculum during the pandemic. So Nico Terry is asking about, you know, the fact that this lecture is recorded. You've been teaching the past year and a half via Zoom. You're not able to do the walking around. I did see some comments in here of how well that works in the classroom. How have the remote learning environment, have you noticed a change in the dynamics of these types of discussions in Hume conferences teaching through Zoom? How have the students responded?
So actually, I'm not the best person to ask that question because I am one of the faculty members who did all my teaching in person. I have to be, in order to do my thing, I have to be in the room and feel the energy. And so, so for the entire last year and a half, I have done all my teaching in person, except for the very end of the semester when everybody had to teach on Zoom. So I much prefer teaching in person to teaching in Zoom. My students definitely prefer being in person as well. You know, some things are obviously easier on Zoom. You can get out of bed and walk to the computer and teach your class. But no, and it was definitely weird, you know, walking across campus and rarely seeing another faculty member. And because of COVID, where I taught had to change in order to enable social distancing. So instead of teaching in a regular classroom, I taught my Hume conference in the psych auditorium. And so no ability to walk around, people are staring at each other's backs, etc. So we had to make those kinds of adjustments. But I thought students did a really great job, and we were still able to have very meaningful encounters.
Thank you. I'm going to move into some questions related to civil rights now. Your timeline, Pancho, made no mention of hip hop. Curious, it seems as though hip hop has addressed issues like mass incarceration, as well as a financial approach to empowerment, and perhaps even Black separatism. Do you have any comments about that?
I would definitely consider hip hop to be part of the larger civil rights movement. When hip hop started, it was very much political and talking about social, economic, and political issues, and brought attention to them in ways that had not been brought before. So yes, my timeline just keeps going, and hip hop is definitely part of that.
Follow-up question to that. Alex is asking your perspective about the current role of art and literature in what you consider the ongoing civil rights movement. Are there particular writers, artists, maybe hip hop artists, musicians, who you consider as particularly influential in this moment?
Well, you know, when Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer Prize, that was an amazing, amazing moment. And you know, I think what Beyonce did with Lemonade, those are two examples of hip hop culture that have had a huge influence on the general population. And you know, the video that Beyonce did in sort of giving us a history of the struggle for civil rights, that has been totally cool. So I would definitely single out Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar.
Thank you. A question from Craig. Do you think that the George Floyd murder can be an important inflection point? Maybe not as big as the Civil War, Brown versus the Board of Education, or the mid-60s civil rights. Craig says he works for state government and it's had a very big impact on his work.
So I would compare George Floyd's murder to what happened during the Vietnam War. When Walter Cronkite started showing dead bodies on television every night on the news, it had a huge effect on the general population and made more people become opposed to the Vietnam War. In a way, it's too bad that it had to happen that way. And I would say the same thing in terms of George Floyd, that it took a lot of people actually seeing the actual process of him being murdered and seeing the knee on his neck for more than 9 minutes. That is what got a lot of people up out of their seats and made them take to the streets. And so I think that for me, seeing lots of white people in those post-George Floyd demonstrations has been really heartening. And again, Black Lives Matter is part of the continuing civil rights movement. And I hope, you know, one hoped, I have to speak in the past tense, one hoped that seeing the murder of George Floyd would make a huge difference in terms of society in general. But unfortunately, since George Floyd, we have continued to see people of color murdered by the police. And even when it's caught on video, it does not seem to be doing enough to stop that kind of perpetuation of violence. But I am very happy that more and more people are getting involved.
Jesse, I believe, is one of your offspring, is in the audience and asked a question. You made a comparison between viewing lynchings and a football game. do you see the NCAA and any other athletic institutions as modern day plantations?
Yes. I think that college athletes are being exploited in all kinds of ways. And, there's this movement going on to pay college athletes for the use of their images, as opposed to the schools reaping all the benefits of that. And I think that that has functioned as a kind of plantation system. And I am very happy at the thought that that can change.
Thank you. Sarah is asking, can you speak to the recent decision in Florida to ban teaching of critical race theory?
When people talk about critical race theory, they usually don't know what they're talking about. I have taught a course relatively recently on critical race theory. And critical race theory is a legal movement in which the law as a body of knowledge is looked at for how it has functioned in a discriminatory way. What people are talking about now when they disparage the term critical race theory, what they really mean is they don't want the truth to be told. So you have schools in Oklahoma, for example, where the massacre in Tulsa is not part of Oklahoma history. You have textbooks that are produced in Texas that don't want to talk about the real causes of slavery. They will say that the cause of the Civil War was states' rights, period. And they leave off the end of the sentence, states' rights to own slaves. That was what the cause of the Civil War was. And that is not sufficiently taught. And so you have this whole generation of school children who are not being taught the truth about American history. In South Africa, at the end of apartheid, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and came to the right conclusion that you cannot have reconciliation until you first tell the truth and admit what really happened. And I think that that is the problem in the United States, that sufficiently taught about slavery, about the genocide against the Native population. And again, we need, in order to move forward as a country, we need to face the demons of the past so that we can move forward. And until we really tell the truth, we are not going to go anywhere.
Pancho, if I could ask a follow-up on that too, because I've been tracking this. I think we are all tracking the way that the phrase critical race theory is thrown around. When it first started appearing, I was a little surprised, because it's clearly also a kind of anti-intellectualism or hostility toward the academy. And I wondered what you had thought, because something I also think is that there's a kind of hostility to Black intellectualism that's a part of this as well. A kind of like, how dare you theorize about the oppression of Black people in this country and tell a story about white people that's not flattering?
Yes, I mean, I think that is part of the kind of racist backlash that we have seen, in particular, during the days of the former president. I was always struck by the phrase, "Make America Great Again." Again, meaning it was great at some point in the future, in the past, and we need to make it great again. So I want to know, when was that moment when America was great? Was it during the time when we were wiping out the Indians? Was it during the time when Black people were slaves for hundreds of years? Was it during the time of Jim Crow? Is it during the time now when George Floyd and everybody else is getting killed? Again, yeah, Black intellectuals have been pushing the telling of the truth in the same way that Black people in South Africa were pushing for the truth to be told about how apartheid functioned. In the same way that Palestinian intellectuals are talking about the way that they have been treated. So it is almost always the case that the people who have been oppressed are going to be the first people to tell the truth. And the people who have been doing the oppressing are always going to be reluctant to have the truth told about themselves.
A few questions related back to your presentation, Pancho. Susan is asking, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but what effect has Cave Canon had on American poetry?
So that is a group of Black writers, mostly young, primarily but not exclusively poets. And it is an opportunity for Black writers to come together and to have a forum where they can read and talk about each other's work, and to do it in a quote unquote safe environment where there isn't the worry about how are white people going to view this. You know, that takes me back to during the Harlem Renaissance. There was this debate between George Schuyler and Langston Hughes. Schuyler wrote this article in The Nation called The Negro Art Hokum, in which he said there was no such thing as Black literature, that it was just literature by American people who just happened to be Black, and there was no difference between white literature and Black literature. And a week later, Langston Hughes responded to that with his essay entitled The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, in which he said there was such a thing as Black literature, and that any writer, any Black writer who said, I want to be known as a writer, not as a Black writer, Hughes said that person was making a huge mistake. And Hughes said that we Black writers are going to write what we want. We're going to tell the truth. If white people like it, okay. If they don't like it, that's okay too. If Black people like it, that's okay. If they don't like it, that's okay too. And so, you know, I think the more freedom that Black writers have to be able to express themselves and not have to worry about what the reaction to it is going to be, the better.
Vijay is asking, can you speak to Afrofuturism?
Afrofuturism. So, so this is a movement that can be seen in film and in literature. Essentially, you are using forms of what is typically called science fiction in order to imagine a different kind of future. The writings of Octavia Butler are particularly of interest in that realm, and a film like Black Panther and the imagination of Wakanda is another example of that. Being able to imagine a future in which Black people can be normal and not have to be the victims of racism.
Thank you. We have a question here about fundraising and diversity at the college. Brian is asking, he received a fundraising request that positioned Reed as a diverse institution, where we had achieved 32% diversity in the student population. Brian says that he argues that a false equivalence exists because Reed's trustees, faculty and leadership and administrative employees are overwhelmingly white and not representative of the diversity of the student population. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So in my ideal world, the numbers of students and faculty would reflect the population of the United States at large. So the United States is, I believe my numbers are correct, 17% Latino and 13% African American. And I think those numbers should be reflected in the faculty and in the student body. And until we get to matching those numbers, we still have a ways to go.
I want to just jump in to say also, I completely agree with Pancho that we need to be working to continue this. And so I would hope that whatever you received, Brian, didn't indicate that this work is done and Reed is now a diverse institution. That would definitely be not a direction that I think we would endorse. Instead, diversity is an ongoing project. I do believe that certain things that we've started doing at Reed will show greater success. For instance, the kind of inclusive hiring practices that we've been using with faculty hires have meant that this last class of newly tenured faculty was majority minority faculty. And so that's good. And we need to just keep doing that. We're also instituting new inclusive staff hiring practices and really thinking through how we're supporting and mentoring staff. So this is all, it's all ongoing. I'm committed to this work, and I do appreciate what you're saying about what we need to do, looking at the top. And these are discussions that we've been having with the trustees throughout the time that I've been here. So we're going to keep going. We just launched a new diversity, equity, inclusivity website, which is going to be a check-in regularly on this work with the acknowledgement that it needs to keep going. Thank you for that question.
Great, thanks. Will has a question here. What sort of mass movement do you think is possible to bridge the gap between poor Black folks, poor white folks, and poor folks of other racial identities? What strategies do you envision being necessary towards that end, particularly in light of the fracturing of our media to appeal to audiences with specific ideological positions? Great question.
Wow. Well, as I said earlier, I think the best way to go about this is for people to start talking in terms of class and talking less in terms of race. As I said earlier, if all the poor folks of color and all the poor white folks got together, they could take down the hierarchy. And the people on top know that. And so they use tools like racism, homophobia, et cetera, They use those tools to keep people separated from each other who have tons of things in common. And so I mean, that's one of the things I try to do in my classes is talk about class as much as possible. Sometimes that upsets people because it has echoes of Marxism, talking about class instead of talking about race. But I embrace that, and I think that is the right direction in which to move.
And Will did say in the chat, "You're welcome, Dad." For that. Mark McLean, class of 1970, says all too often attempts to tell the truth are set in a framework that comes across as a guilt trip. Is there a way to change that framework?
I don't like talking about things in terms of guilt. You know, if you are benefiting from a racist world, then that is something that you need to face up to and acknowledge, and understand how to move on beyond that. What guilt too often does is that it traps people, and they don't think that there's a way out of it. Feeling guilty, you know, that doesn't really get anywhere. What are you gonna do is the real issue. And again, people have to be educated and enlightened so that they know the true history of this country and what has gone on and how people have benefited and continue to benefit from the lack of equality.
Sorry, I'm reading lots of questions that are coming in. Maybe following up to that, what do you think is the impact of color-based terminology, black, white, et cetera, on racism and division in America? Can you imagine a functional, useful way to move forward that might move away somehow from this terminology without diminishing the importance of those terms up to this point? Or is it at this point inextricable or necessary?
I think for the time being, it is probably necessary. One of the questions that I get asked about terminology is, do I have a preference for African American as opposed to Black? And I actually prefer Black because African American is limited to the Black population in the United States. It doesn't include people from Africa. It doesn't include people from the Caribbean. And so as far as I'm concerned, all Black people in the United States, regardless of where they are originally from, are discriminated against. And so I prefer to use the more all-encompassing term Black.
Here's a question on jazz. Does jazz continue to play a role in the ongoing civil rights movement, or has it been watered down again? Is there any more of a focus on jazz theory or history at Reed right now?
The answer to the first part of the question is no. Jazz has not been watered down, and jazz continues to serve a very vital function in the community. I talk about jazz in my classes whenever the opportunity presents itself. In terms of Reed's curriculum in general, the obvious place that would come from would be from the music department. And the music department is small, only has, I think, 4 faculty members, one of whom specializes in part on jazz. So I would like to see more of that. There's a Reed jazz band that puts on performances on Friday afternoons and plays at various kinds of public functions. The more of that, the better. I believe that, how do I want to put this? For me, as a Black person, jazz is my religion, jazz is my philosophy, jazz is my lens through which I see the universe. I can't imagine my life without jazz. I saw yesterday, I saw this little clip on television, and they were asking the mayoral candidates for New York City, what is the one thing you couldn't live without? And my first response was music.
I think that's a great close. We are going to need to end. at this point. I know there are a few extra questions in there. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I want to thank you, Pancho, for your time and for your wisdom and for engaging everyone. Of all of the sessions at reunions, I've not seen this level of interaction in the chat. And so that's props to you. Thank you, Pancho.
And
Audrey, thank you.
anybody out there who wants to shoot me a question, I will be happy to answer it. So thank you all for coming.